Lishana Tova Umituka, a sweet and beautiful new year to all of you. Thanks for joining me virtually at Beth Israel Congregation in Waterville, Maine, the home for Jewish life since 1902. Some words of Torah. There are certain conversations that I recall from my 20s with a certain amount of sweetness and more than a fair amount of embarrassment. On one hand, I look back with sweetness that I could have been so naive. And then on the other hand, I look back and I think to myself, how could I have believed something so deeply that was so simplistic or silly or arrogant or hurtful? When I think back to some of those conversations from my 20s, I feel so deeply grateful to the mentors who sat with me through it all, who hid smirks and withheld strong emotional reactions, and were just willing to go along with me on the wild, serpentine, bumpy ride of my maturation along with me. When I was midway through rabbinical school, quite a few of my classmates had met their spouses as undergraduates. They were already married and were having children. I was still single, and my future progeny existed in a purely theoretical realm. I was going to have at least 4 children with my then imaginary wife, and they would all go to Jewish day school, and because they would be raised in a traditional home, they would all have strong, secure, indestructible Jewish identities. I had an image in my head of all 6 of us, at least, walking down a suburban New Jersey street in traditional Shabbat clothes, walking to synagogue each Shabbat, setting the foundation for 4 kids who would go on to live the standard conservative movement life. Solomon Schechter Day School, Camp Ramah, Ivy League College and graduate school, and after a gap year or 2 in Israel, a graduate school and 4 kids of their own. One of my mentors, who would go on to marry Mel and me, Rabbi Carrie Carter, smiled and nodded slowly as we sat on the stoop outside of her Brooklyn apartment, and I told her about my vision of my future. You know, Rachel, life might not work out for you that way, she offered gingerly. I didn't wait a second with my response. No, I'm going to make sure of it. Rabbi Dorf's tshuva, his legal opinion, still stands. The minimum number of children Jews should have is 4. 2 for replacement, 1 for addition, and 1 to make up for the Holocaust. Whatever it takes, I'm going to do my part. Jewish families aren't having enough kids anymore. And it's basic math, Rabbi Carter. No kids, no future. And I could see Rabbi Carter take a deep breath, probably at least in part to resist the urge to hit me. As the sun set over the horizon of our brownstone Brooklyn neighborhood, Rabbi Carter, then the new mother of one hard-won only child, gave me another smile. You know, Rachel, one of my rabbis once told me that it's our job to make sure that we create a world in which Jewish children can thrive. That's what I'm committed to making that world. I sat next to her and nodded and smiled back. Okay, I responded, still holding on pretty tightly to my envisioned future. As I progressed through the seminary, I learned that the topic of fertility in Jewish law had already created major fissures in the movement, especially after women made up larger and more confident portions of every rabbinical school class. When Rabbi Dorf came out from LA to New York and spoke about his legal opinion, which until that point was mostly treated as canonical and uncontroversial, the future women rabbis in the room pushed back hard. While the seminary was still mostly attended by young men from middle and upper middle class backgrounds. As women became more comfortable and vocal in the seminary, the tenor and assumptions of the place changed. The women training to be rabbis were not simply living womenized versions of their male classmates' lives. Many struggled to find partners willing to marry a rabbi, or were married and struggled mightily to get pregnant, or who wanted to have more children but could not afford childcare for their young children without a stay-at-home spouse. The major legal authorities of our movement were taken aback. They weren't just receiving pushback from a more liberal and lenient laity, but rather from the conservative movement's future rabbis. Jewish law's claims on women's bodies was fomenting a kind of revolt and a cry that reflected pretty deep pain, a cry that said, "You're not going to make me feel guilty or like I have sinned because my body cannot carry and deliver the future you are demanding and taking for granted." The cry of these young Jewish leaders was simultaneously reminiscent and distinct from so many of the cries of our foremothers, most notably in this season, Hanukkah. Of course, it's similar. It is the pain that comes from not being able to fulfill social and tribal expectations around rearing children and not receiving the status and comfort that comes from fulfilling those expectations, along with not attaining a certain kind of joy that comes from parenthood. And on the other hand, it's different. These women training to be rabbis, like most other professional Jewish women, have so much more in their lives, so many more avenues to actualize themselves and contribute to the Jewish people. They were dedicating themselves to learning and teaching Torah, to building and sustaining Jewish communities. In essence, contributing all that men had given to the Jewish people for many previous generations. The cries of these classes of women rabbinical students may have been just as deep as those of our ancestors, but it was not as unicausal as the plea of our foremothers. And in making their cries public, in not muffling them as the very first generation of women rabbinical students had, these classes of rabbinical students laid the groundwork for an important moment in the evolution of conservative Judaism. This historical moment of confronting the movement's expectations around Jewish continuity would be the first of many times, as our movement became more diverse, that our leadership would realize that admitting a more varied student body would involve more than opening the doors just to a new set of individuals, but would also require internal changes that actually allowed these new classes of rabbis to thrive as fully embodied and dignified members of the Jewish people. One thing our leadership would need to sacrifice is the assumption that Jewish women could and would perform a kind of physical reproduction as they had in generations past. They would have to sacrifice the idea that we would fully embody and replicate the lives of Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, and Leah, Hannah, or Penina, or our grandmothers. We wouldn't be more and less than they were, or we would be more and less than they were, trying our best to contribute our all in the context of historical, personal, and familial expectations in a radically changing modern context. It would be easy for me to end my sermon here. A story of feminist triumph over traditional patriarchal Jewish expectations, or a shrug of the shoulders that the world has changed and we'll all just need to deal with the consequences. But the story isn't that simple, and it isn't over. And I'm not the kind of rabbi that tells simple triumphalist tales, even though we seem to have a real hunger for them at this historical and social moment. I'm deeply committed to a Jewish future, and futures do actually require subsequent generations. And yet we are in a historical moment when the conflicted cries of those classes of women rabbinical students have given way to something far more strident and accusatory than that initial cry of despair. There's a harsh debate evolving between generations of Jewish feminists around a central question. Is any expectation of raising future generations inherently oppressive? Which is to say, is the labor of reproduction inherently oppressive to women? And if so, should it be totally taboo to launch Jewish demographic studies or to discuss expectations of Jewish parenthood with young Jewish adults? Should Jewish leadership, lay and professional, be totally value neutral on the topic of raising Jewish children, a quest that is as sensitive and potentially painful as it is essential to building a Jewish future? We live in a moment where nothing is valued as much as silence by the majority of our population. Increasingly, we are choosing to either not have difficult conversations or say what we really believe in hushed tones in private, because it feels like, and it's probably the case, that the consequences have never been greater for wrong think and wrong speak. And yet, it is my job to talk about things that matter, and in particular, the creation and sustenance of the Jewish people and our collective destiny. And so much of our high holidays are wrapped up in narratives of women struggling to have children and parents of any gender grappling mightily with the labor of raising children in line with their faith. Hannah struggles to conceive and then dedicates her only son to service in the temple for the glory of God and the Jewish people. Abraham and Sarah cannot believe that they will ever have a biological son together. And when they do, they err badly with their first son, Ishmael, and his mother, Hagar, and then permanently scar Isaac by putting him on the altar. The story of the conception of the world is buttressed with stories of miraculous births and rocky, uncertain narratives of parents and the relationships they have with their children. While this moment in 2021 is uniquely precarious in terms of what we are willing to discuss and what we are not willing to engage with publicly, something that has remained timeless is the fraught nature of bearing, adopting, and raising children. And yet, we read these stories year after year because at its core, these archetypal stories tell us about the way forward. Building families is the avodah, the service, the labor we do most intimately with God in building a global, human, and Jewish future. So how do we move forward ethically, sensitively, and honestly? I think in order to move this conversation forward, we need to think more broadly about what it means to create and sustain Jewish lives and support Jewish parenthood in ways that dignify individuals and strengthen communities without guilt or narrow definitions of success. I hope that this sermon serves as the beginning of a conversation together, because I don't have all the answers. But I do know that we need to have these conversations. And we cannot afford to let shame, guilt, or fear keep us from speaking honestly about the labor it will take to usher in another generation. Before I offer my personal thoughts, I want to offer two evocative stories from our tradition. The first was written by an amazing woman, a rare historical figure who was a highly literate businesswoman in the Middle Ages, Gluckel of Hamelin, who lived in 17th century Germany. This is her story. A bird once set out to cross a windy sea with its 3 fledglings. The sea was so wide and the wind so strong, the father bird was forced to carry his young, one by one, in his strong claws. When he was halfway across with the first fledgling, the wind turned into a gale, and he said, "My child, look how I am struggling and risking my life on your behalf. When you are grown up, will you do as much for me and provide for me in my old age?" The fledgling replied, "Only bring me to safety, and when you are old, I shall do everything you ask of me." Whereat the father bird dropped his child into the sea, and it drowned, and he said, "So shall it be done to such a liar as you." Then the father bird returned to shore and set forth with the second fledgling, asked the same question, and receiving the same answer, drowned the second child with the cry, "You too are a liar." Finally, he set out with the third fledgling, and when he asked the same question, the third fledgling replied, "My dear father, it is true you are struggling mightily and risking your life on my behalf, and I shall be wrong not to repay you when you are old. But I cannot bind myself. This, though, I can promise. When I am grown up and have children of my own, I shall do as much for them as you have done for me." Whereupon the father bird said, "Well spoken, my child, and wisely. Your life I will spare, and I will carry you to shore in safety." For Gluckel of Hamelin, we repay the love and labor of our parents through the love we give to the next generation. We can show love and care to our parents for all they have given to us, and we must do so. And yet it is through transmitting love forward that we achieve a certain kind of transcendence and provide previous generations with Chayei Olam, eternal life through the transmission of legacy. However, I think that it's too narrow to ascribe that role purely through biological means. I think it is unethical and unhelpful and doesn't represent the lives of modern Jews, nor does it fully acknowledge the full diversity of the ways in which we can contribute to a robust and sustainable Jewish future. And also, I offer a second beautiful story from our tradition, Sefer Yetzirah, the earliest Jewish mystical text. "And when Abraham our father, may he rest in peace, looked, saw, understood, probed, engraved, and carved, he was successful in creation, as it is written, and the souls they made in Haran," Genesis 12:5. "Immediately there was revealed to him the master of all, may God's name be blessed forever. God placed him in God's bosom and kissed him on the head, and he called him Abraham, my beloved," Isaiah 41:8. "He made a covenant with him and with his children after him forever, as it is written, and he believed in God, and God considered it righteousness. He made with him a covenant between the 10 fingers of his hands, this covenant of the tongue, and between the 10 toes of his feet, this is the covenant of circumcision. And he bound 22 letters of Torah to his tongue, and he revealed to him God's mystery. God drew them in water, God flamed them with fire, God agitated them with breath. God burned them with the 7 planets, God directed them with 12 constellations." End quote. Abraham and Sarah brought many generations of Jews into the world through 3 separate means, all of which drew them into God's bosom, the divine embrace sealed with a divine kiss on the kepi, the head. Abraham and Sarah first created Jewish lives by choosing Judaism for themselves as the first converts, and then inspired others to of Haran. They chose Judaism and created pathways for others to come along with them, pathways pursued by souls in Haran who were inspired by Abraham and Sarah's authentic hospitality. Then they adopted by means of surrogacy with Hagar. And look, Abraham and Sarah messed up that process royally and took advantage of ethnic and class hierarchies to build their family in ways that should not be emulated or really be held up as a totally positive model. But Ishmael too became part of the Jewish future, if not the Jewish people, and grew into the father of a great nation, and who stood at Abraham's grave with his brother Isaac to bury their shared father with love and honor. And finally, they had Isaac, another complicated parenting story, but one that continued the line with Jacob and Esau and many subsequent generations. The first Jews, Abraham and Sarah, created multiple Jewish families through multiple avenues of reproduction. And for what it's worth, conversion was the pathway that seemed to create the least drama. Although who knows, I wasn't in Haran. I'm sure there was at least some mishigas there, even if we didn't get all the details in Genesis. And through all these means of reproduction, there came multiple covenants, multiple promises with God that connected Abraham to the divine. There was the covenant of tzedakah, justice and generosity, the covenant of the mouth, the heart, the feet. There are many pathways to creating Jewish futures and covenants, but all of them take work, labor, and community support. They all involve the mishigas and misery of engaging with other people, and the heavy labor of raising children and guiding them toward healthy, committed forms of Jewish adulthood. That takes money, takes patience, extended families, and involved communities. One of the things I love most about Beth Israel is that one of the Hebrew school kids has started calling me Ima, because that's what they hear my kids call me. And my children are being raised collectively by so many members of the congregation, including the dog, Sugar Ray, our first regular canine attendee of Shabbat services. What a rare blessing in 2021. In Waterville, we, meaning our congregation, are raising American Jewish kids who know multiple adults to whom they can turn to for love, support, guidance, and Jewish education. All of us are contributing to building a Jewish future, and I think in ways that are far more powerful and sustainable and doable than trying to build a future generation through isolated, discrete, nuclear families. We Jews are a tribe, and there have always been multiple ways to join, contribute, and commit. And when we are at our best, we aren't doing any of this work, whether it be preparing for conversion, ushering new members into the covenant, adopting children, or bearing them biologically. We aren't doing any of this labor by ourselves. We need collective effort and resources to make it all work. And when we do, we get the greatest gifts of all, a hug and a kiss on the kepi from Avinu Shebashamayim, our Father in heaven, a God who loves bringing God's children close by drawing them into his nursing bosom and is waiting for us to live lives, Jewish lives, that make us worthy of the name beloved. My life didn't end up the way I envisioned it in my 20s, and a little over a decade after that sunset conversation with Rabbi Carter on her Brooklyn stoop, I can fully hear her words of wisdom. Our families rarely, if ever, take the form we envision. Our bodies don't always actualize the deepest strivings of our soul, and our children don't usually turn out exactly the way we ideally hope they will. We don't always have the resources to create our ideal families, or we struggle to balance having enough to give our kids all they need. And yet, our future beckons. God and our ancestors challenge us. Will you be the last? And so we need to respond with wisdom that is deeply ancient and needed in this modern world. We will answer the call in multiple forms, in multiple tones, crafting a symphonic future through Jews who have come into this world in multiple ways. As we learn in the Mishnah, we are not required to finish the work, nor are we free to desist from it. In this year to come, a year of unparalleled uncertainty about the human, American, and Jewish futures, we have to be committed to have the faith to keep on giving from the wellspring of blessings and gifts we have at our disposal, which are different for every member of the Jewish people. No matter how we create, build, and sustain Jewish life, we need to contribute something. And if we're doing it right, it should feel like true Avodat Kodesh, holy, difficult, sanctified labor. Happy birthday to the world, and happy Creation Day to us. Let's keep creating and building a world worthy of God's love and blessing. L'shana tova u'metuka.